Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by the Dallas Stars skating coach, Luke Chilcott. Luke is in his 7th season working as a skating coach in the National Hockey League and his 2nd with the Dallas Stars. Luke helps develop a deeper knowledge of edge work and efficiency through correct technique and assists players in analyzing beneficial equipment as it relates to on-ice performance. Luke works in the same capacity the American Hockey League's Texas Stars this season and plays a role in developing the Stars' prospects through remote and in-person coaching throughout the course of the year, including the team's annual development camp. Luke previously worked with the Allen Americans in the East Coast Hockey League. A very, very interesting discussion. Luke and I kind of geek out over skating efficiency, biomechanics. We talk about his current roles and responsibilities with the Dallas Stars. We speak about what it means to be an efficient skater, biomechanics, what are landmarks that he looks at, what are common skating energy leaks that he sees in young players. We talk about the difference in working with young players and contrasting that to the professional ranks. And we talk also about modifications in equipment. It's a really, really interesting, educational, and insightful conversation. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast. Luke, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. No worries at all.
This is going to be a really interesting one. We talked off air. First guest in our 3 years that is a skating coach in the National Hockey League. I want to start and rewind back. First of all, let the listener know a little bit about your background and kind of how you ended up where you're at currently right now with the Dallas Stars.
Yeah, so a little bit of my background comes mainly from growing up in a skating family. So both my parents were coaches growing up, and they were both my coaches as well. And so a little bit of that rink rat lifestyle. I was always in the rink. I was playing a little bit of hockey when I was younger, figure skating a little bit. Obviously grew up in the UK. The accent's a bit of a giveaway, but I know it sounds a bit funky now, having lived in the States for 20 years. But yeah, no, grew up in the UK and then learned how to kind of skate in both pairs of skates. I would kind of interchange my figure skates for hockey skates. I would play both sports, tapered that down to mainly just figure skating after having a bit more success in figure skating. Even though I loved hockey, as a youth athlete, anything where you're succeeding more often than not, that kind of you gravitate towards that. So I ended up figure skating competitively for Team Great Britain. And that's really what brought me out to the States, because at the time we had some friends that had already kind of emigrated out there. And that's what brought me to this area in Dallas. Funnily enough, the Stars had won the Cup in '99. Then obviously they expanded, built more rinks at the early part of the turn of the millennium kind of thing. And then that is what brought my parents out to the Frisco area. And I was training in the same rink that the Stars built as their state-of-the-art facility. So it was great. It was a good transition. And then fast forward through the competitive years, I got injured in 2012. And that kept me off the ice because it was a low back injury. Chose to not go with surgery, wanted to really take care of it through PT. But that also meant being away from the ice for a long time. And during that time away from my competitive training hours, I was also working with a lot of youth hockey players, helping them with their skating, kind of giving them edge work exercises to help them understand the mechanics of skating. And back then I was really just doing it as, this is how I was taught how to use my edges. Is it helping you? Very trial and error way of coaching. And then that grew from a side hustle into a full-on business. I was eventually training kids. They were playing at a higher level. The period of time I was off the ice doing PT was about 9 months. So, we went from having them finish a season, train with me through summer. Some of them were fortunate enough to make a higher level, graduating from single A to double A and so on. And so it was really fun to kind of train these kids, watch them improve. And then through word of mouth locally, my business grew and grew.
Wow. Interesting story, which leads us kind of where we're at today. What are your current responsibilities? You're a skating coach for the Dallas Stars. What does that encompass? Give the listener an idea of, I know that may change pending the season, right? Off season or in season. Give us a typical day for you, maybe one in the off season and perhaps one in the in season.
Yeah. So in season, I think your duties shift is A, the NHL level is obviously trained to perform. So when you go in to see them, you are really working on skills that are tailored to in-game adjustments. And it's a long season, and so there's no way you can give a player some habits to work on, but they've really got to be on the service road to the highway. You've got to make sure that if you give them some skills that they're going to use a week from now, it can't be a complete overhaul of like stride mechanics or where they keep their weight. It really has to be positionally targeted. And then from there, it's similar to the AHL, but obviously the AHL has a bit of a luxury of more time off between games. Now, obviously, the schedule is still quite packed, but there's weeks that mirror more of a college USHL schedule. So those are the weeks where I will pop down and visit our AHL team, and I'll be there, Tuesday through usually one of the games at the weekend, because that's where it's great for me to see the guys play in person. Um, Being in the rink and having a bird's eye view of the defensive patterns, like where our D men are skating, you get a better idea for that being in the arena. So I will do Tuesday through, let's say Saturday evening, and then come home Sunday. So yeah, going back to that example of in season with both pro levels, I will go in with the AHL. I'll probably run more edge work, try and go through a progression of things that we can spend more time on because we have that luxury.
Sure.
And then as the week goes on, our coach down in Austin, Neil Graham, he's very good about allotting some time earlier in the week for skill development, so we can get into the nuts and bolts of maybe some tight turn mechanics, maybe some linear crossover work, things like that. And then we'll kind of go through the week, and it will go from Tuesday being more skills time, enough time to break it down, to then Wednesday more pre and post practice. Thursday maybe just a little bit pre, some post, and then obviously morning skates. I'll just take care of the guys that aren't playing that night, so they have something to work on. You might be out the lineup, which doesn't feel great for anyone, but at least you have something to work on, right? And that gives you a little bit of a hope as to what you can improve to get yourself back in the lineup. And I like to approach it that way for my position.
Excellent. Kind of a very broad based question, Luke. Philosophy, skating philosophy. Someone asked Anthony, what's your strength and conditioning philosophy? I've been doing this for 25 years, and my philosophy is subject to change when I learn more, right? So it's kind of an iteration over time. But if you were to sum up your philosophy in terms and measures of how you coach, or just your view on skating, period, how would you sum that up?
I think skating's interesting because I like how I skate, and it's funny because I'm a fairly short-statured guy. I'm 5'6". I've always relied on agility. Being a multi-sport athlete, even when I figure skated, I was more of the prey. You know what I mean? So it was more about flight of foot. When I played rugby, it was more about agility, not getting caught. And I've always skated more so that way. And so my philosophy when I went into coaching youth hockey players was I put a huge emphasis on agility. Rather than just being good at edge work or just being good at forward strides, or I thought that tight turning, using your edge work, being able to skate laterally, unexpectedly, evasive skating was where most kids would find benefit that weekend. So even if I had a little skater who was, 6 or 7, if we worked on some inside edge work and then some tight turning work, that translated to them being able to game more effectively at the weekend. And so I thought that agility was where I put a lot of my focus. And so I built a lot of drills around that, with your inside edge work, outside edge work, tight turning mechanics. And then that kind of turned into rapid deceleration, which is something I'm still big on with the NHL side of it, just because we play a sport that's on a controlled sheet of ice. It's not getting any bigger anytime soon. So I've always, it's funny how back when I first started coaching, I put an emphasis on agility, and then now even at the level I'm coaching now, there's not that much difference with the NHL side of it, because if you can't create your own space and be agile enough to find ice when the ice isn't getting any bigger physically, then you're just going to have more success.
Yeah. I look at this in strength and conditioning. Correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned, several questions back. You said, I watch some of the players and I watch patterns in the game. I think that's really important. I'll give you strength and conditioning, for example. You'll see a lot of fancy things and fancy exercises on strength and conditioning on social media that really don't have a large effect on a really good program. Do you see that in power skating where you see a lot of flash and sizzle and you say, wow, is that actually happening in a game? Do you see that with some of the social media as well in what you do? Or, as opposed to here are the patterns, here's what the athletes are expected to do shift by shift based on a D-man, based on a forward, based on a winger. These are the patterns and these are the edges and the focus. So it's much more targeted as opposed to the bells and whistles.
Yeah, that's a funny. It's a good question because social media has brought up a way to promote everything you're working on,
Yes,
and it's important to be passionate about what you're working on. I think it's also important at some point to have enough research in your own time to realize maybe this isn't the best way to do something, and then to pivot from that. And there's been examples with that with me. I've always tried to take the skating work that I have and run it through other professionals. Mainly, like we have some really good physical therapists that obviously work with our club. Through being an athlete, I've had injuries over the years, and I'll still reach out to past orthopedic surgeons that I've kind of worked with and run skating technique through them because they have a better understanding of what might cause injuries. So, having said all of that, when you watch some drills and exercises that are on social media, all you can think about is, like I said earlier, how much of this is only to get good at that exercise, but it doesn't necessarily help you in the short term playing the game,
sure.
right? So yeah, I do. I like the auxiliary exercises that a lot of. I think that's important. But then, even on my own social media account, I really love to promote kids that have good three turns, which is your inside and your outside edge work, control, coordination. I think those travel right alongside, like I said before, merging right onto the highway and using those same skating skills to play the game. If and that's not to say that there aren't other things you can do. There's lots of different agility drills on social media, YouTube, that help kids with their proprioception and athleticism in general. And there's probably a place for that. But I know, if I'm going back to just my pillars of coaching, I like to keep things as close to the game as possible, which hopefully helps those kids stick in the game, helps them stick with the game right away, would be the best example. Yeah.
Target context, target environment. I like it. And I like your idea of auxiliary exercises. Okay, slight pivot here, Luke. Chilcott skating mechanics. You work with a wide demographic and breadth. So you work with National Hockey League players, you work with youth players. This is a tough question to answer. I know it might not be written on a napkin, but skating efficiency, right? The equivalency of riding a bike with a rusty bike chain or WD-40. We both get across the finish line. One's more efficient, wastes less energy. One may not break down over time. What is textbook skating efficiency? How do you look for that? Define that.
Yeah, but it's a great example because obviously Jeff Skinner grew up figure skating and he has some incredibly efficient skating technique in all of the planes. So that's kind of setting me up because I was just watching him play even the other night, and you think to yourself, like, this guy could play another 1,000 games. It doesn't look like, because there's no rust on that bike chain, he could
Yep.
ride it another 1,000 miles. So skating efficiency for me is having the proprioceptive ability to always work with the direction of travel. So you
Okay.
don't want to fight it at any point, right? Like, you don't want to be grinding through the mud. You want to always feel like you're working with those mechanics. And so a little bit of that for me comes back to, if I'm scouting some players, I'll look for guys that naturally keep their center of mass ahead of that ground contact in all directions. And that would be my definition of efficiency in skating. Because if you can change directions and you're naturally already shifting your weight and rotating your trunk to accelerate in that direction, you're never really fighting that momentum or fighting the direction of travel. You're always working it into how you want to force the body to get there, if that makes sense. So a
Sure.
bit like a cat always landing on its feet, guys that can naturally morph and work their center of mass around their ground contact will therefore probably play for longer. And if you can do that naturally, a lot of that, and then at the pro level, I can really work with that. If you don't have that, we're going to have to really throttle back all of your skating exercises because I can't force you into positions. And I know everyone wants to get there and get to those loose puck retrievals as quick as possible. But if you're always fighting that, you're only putting wear and tear on your body, right? And so, yeah, that would be, in short, true skating efficiency would be the guys that can coordinate their body to get the center of mass ahead of their ground contact more often than not.
I like it. Are there any anatomical landmarks that, for example, you're watching tape on a National Hockey League player and you pause it or you rewind it back slow motion to look at those mechanics and say, oh, these are, one or two areas that I really hone in on. Is it center of mass only, or are there any other landmarks that you hone in on or focus on anatomically?
I think there's a lot of emphasis on posture in general, which then, it's tough because with all the equipment, there could be a lot going on inside the equipment and then inside the human body as well. So that's what makes it interesting when you're just watching a game and you're trying to scout guys' skating proficiency. However, if you have good positive shin angle, you coordinate that center of mass ahead of ground contact, you have good posture. There's a lot of things that will just stem from those three attributes, I think.
You know what? I'm piggybacking on this because I view it very similarly. Looking at just from a sheer biomechanics and watching video standpoint, I copied this idea from Derek Hansen. He calls it the hashtag, but I look at run to glide mechanics for hockey players and I pause the video and I'll look at shin angles and then I'll look at what they call a trunk segmental angle and I'll draw two lines. And I'd like those lines to be parallel, meaning I got a positive shin angle and I have a low trunk segmental angle. Then I draw a line shoulder to hips and I want to see if those lines are parallel as well, creating a hashtag, essentially looking what you're looking at, Luke, just a different anatomical landmarks, center of mass, obviously lining up with what you talked about, specifically for that run to glide. So I look at, again, just watching video, I look at that trunk segmental angle, hips, and then I look at feet coming underneath the hips back at touchdown, if that makes any sense. But I think that's all in what you're talking about on that center of mass.
Oh, yeah, no, 100%.
Several mistakes, and I don't want to talk about National Hockey League players right now. This is your work with your company, Chilcott Skating Mechanics. I'm a young player. You see a lot of young players, hundreds, thousands. Okay, what are some common rusty bike chains that you see?
Yeah, that's a good one because when I first started coaching, I was working with players that were in learn to skate. And then just naturally with the territory, you get more AAA students or you get pro players or some NCAA players reach out to you. But I still, even if you were to drop into one of the rinks on a weekly basis, you'd still see me have a few AA players here and there, a couple of AAA players, but they're also younger, maybe the 10U, 12U, not so much 8U, but I'm not against working with those 8U players for that reason. You want to try and get those habits in as early as possible. So sometimes if I get a player that's come to me and now they're 10U, 12U, and they're saying like, well, we really want to make the jump from AA to AAA, some of the things you look for, and it goes back to the coordinating that center of mass of ground contact, a lot of youth players will land heel first, which is always interesting to me because I don't have a background in biomechanics, but I am very, very accustomed to watching how people skate.
Of
And
course.
then I've tried to video myself because I grew up on the ice. So, and then my skating ability is something that people always want to try and mirror, which is a great compliment. So then you have to try and I've tried to work it backwards, as awkward as that is. You've got to video yourself and you hear a lot of compliments about well, I want to try and skate like you, Luke. And then I think to myself, well, I don't really even know how I get into those positions, right?
Yep.
So one of the things I look for is if a player is crossing over, for example, you always want to try and land, in my opinion, through that big toe, pinky toe, ball of the foot. And then when you're completely into that dorsiflexion, then you can have some weight pressuring on the heel. So if you have kids just do some crossovers on a circle, that crossing over foot, if they lead with their heel, in general, for me, that's just not a very athletic movement. If you were to put me on an agility ladder and give me a completely new pattern to learn, I would never touch the ground with my heels. And that's just me being fairly athletic. So that's a big one for me. If I watch a player cross over and they lead with their heels, we'll try and get you to land on the ball of your foot, naturally getting at least ground contact underneath your center of mass. And then as we lean on our edges, sure enough, your body weight's going to get ahead of that ground contact. And then you can really apply efficiency there. Other little mistakes are a bit like that hip hinge angle, or that trunk segmental angle. If kids will really think, if I can just dump enough weight over my toes and then move my feet as hard as I can, I'm accelerating efficiently. Sorry. So that's a bit of a habit you want to work them out of, because then when you start playing the game, you're unstable if you're in that position. Your field of vision is hindered, obviously, and that's in a fast moving sport like hockey. You got to be able to do it all at the same time. So yeah, posture and probably ground contact. That's a big thing for me.
I work with my nephew. I work with my nieces, and I know the big impetus right now on USA Hockey, specifically the ages of 6 and 8U, is this impetus of fun. I look, if someone were to tell me, Luke, long-term athletic development is play multiple sports and have fun, I'm sold. Having said that, when I look at some of the practice plans, everything is games-based. And that's what I would consider random practice, right? You're practicing multiple skills all at once. I would make the argument that there is a massive need for block practice. Skating or hockey is the only team sport played on the ice. What I mean by block practice is repetitive, same drill, edge work, inside edge work, skating. When you're working with young players, do you feel blocked practice is very important? Meaning, I'm going to focus on the inside edge for drill, 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 drill. Then I might work on the outside edge, drill, 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 as opposed to combining all of those at once, specifically for young hockey players.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I could see how what makes it difficult with block practice is multiple different coaching personalities.
Yes.
Because you could really harp on one thing and it be monotonous and boring. And you could have a coach who, is a bit like a drill sergeant who says, well, that's what you need to succeed. And with me, I probably err on the softer side working with kids. It's not, I do hear a lot of time like, well, no, you can be harder with them. Like they could do that over and over. They need that, right? But like I said, I grew up playing sports and being an athlete, and that's kind of boring to me. So even in my lessons, if I'm working on inside edge work, that day, depending on what the plan is for that group, we might try to layer multiple inside edge work drills into that then bleed into game situation drills. So then they can use that inside edge work in a game situation, which makes it very fun, and I think my belief is that should be fun for a player at any level, NHL all the way down to kids.
100%. So it sounds like that approach is block, and then taking it to random environments, right? Does that sound right? And then obviously you're having fun, whether regardless if you're having block practice or random, you're still going to have fun doing it, pending the right personality and the person coaching it, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And even, I would go as far as to say, figure out how to use different modalities in that block practice. So if there's, if we're doing inside edges and it's just inside edge work with a focus on, where you're pressuring the weight on the sole of your foot and where you're leading your body to, maybe bust out the iPad video, and then show the player the video. Hey, here's what I'm seeing. And then they might have that aha moment of, okay, even within these boring edge work drills, I can see what Luke's trying to get me to do. And then the next time they do it, show the before and after. Then the player feels like they've improved and they've got a better understanding of their inside edges. They get off the ice feeling like they've improved their inside edges right there in that 1 hour-long session. And so, yeah, even though it's block, it doesn't have to be, on the goal line, do it again, blow the whistle, right?
Exactly. No, exactly.
Yeah.
Today's episode has been brought to you by Physical Preparation for Ice Hockey, Biological Principles and Practical Solutions, and the Gain Go Grow Manual. This is a 2-part book series exploring training the intermediate and advanced level players. Book number 1 explores training the intermediate player. Chapters include long-term athletic development, considerations, speed training, power training, strength training, and program design. The Gain Go Grow Manual explores training a high-performance hockey player. Chapters include biomechanics of ice hockey, considerations for high performers, minimizing adaptational risks while upsizing gains, the Gain Go Grow model, and example microcycles. More information can be found at Amazon.com. We talked about this off air several conversations ago, maybe a few weeks ago. Anthropometrics, body type. Depending on different body types, certain individuals are going to have a harder time getting quote unquote deep in their stride. Is there a perfect build for efficient skaters? And then conversely, Luke, like, is there a build that is just more, doesn't mean you can't be a good skater, but it's just your body skeletally, the proportions are just going to be harder to get lower. And when I say get lower, I look at it from a biomechanical standpoint, just looking at research. We overcome two frictions to try to skate faster. The friction on the ice, which looks like my hairline, like I don't have much, right? And then air resistance, right? The deeper we get, so the more positive our shin angles, hopefully the lower our trunk segmental angles, we're lower in our stride. Does that make sense? I guess my question getting back to that is there a build that you would think is more efficient? No one, this is God-given. We can't change that. You can't train out of that, right? Although we might talk about a little bit later equipment modifications, but do you see anything like that? Or do you say, that, I'll just coach the athlete as is, or is there a particular build that you're like, it's an efficient skater?
Yeah, I think guys that do have, slightly shorter torsos and longer lower body limbs, they can get away with a bit more, right? And again, if you coordinate it all correctly, it can be a weapon, right? And then when you go through that, when you go through puberty and you can add power to that efficient technique, that is your perfect skater, And so for me, my favorite skater in the NHL, and has been for a while, is Jack Eichel. And, there's no surprise when you hear stories from the strength and conditioning field. They talk about how strong he is in the gym, and then I obviously watch him skate and he seems to be mobile. He seems to be pliable. There's many different planes he skates in. It looks efficient while he's doing it. So that build to me would be the ideal build to have. And again, the other thing that happens is there's a lot that gets to there, though, because even if you have a great build for skating, you have to understand that skating is a long ground contact movement, right? And so kids and coaches alike, when you hear that, just move your feet, that it kills me a little bit, because you want, even at an early age, kids to trust long ground contact and applied force over a long amount of time in contact with the ice. So, when you watch somebody like a Jack, for example, you can see that power being applied with that long stride. Nothing seems to be in a hurry. I've had some coaches tell me, don't you think that stride is almost too long? And I think the only reason it looks that long is because it's rare for guys to be applying that same amount of power for such a long time and then just cruising up the ice. And we're fortunate here in Dallas. Obviously, we've got Rope, who skates exactly like that. Like, the best way I explain it for people, and he's a good example for that same build. It's like a rowing machine. When you grab the handles and you apply all that power with your legs, you're pulling that chain up for a long time, but the amount of power you're pulling is hefty. And someone might walk past somebody on that rowing machine and not know that, right? It looks like they're barely working, but the torque that they're applying while they're exploding away from those foot plates is huge, So those two guys have that perfect build, and they trust that long ground contact. And then now they've built the strength and conditioning into it, and they can just, eat up ice. I think the new NHL data on the mile per hour that those guys are hitting on the ice more often than others is wild.
You bring up 2 points. You and I talked about this off air. I call it the lightning bolt. I think and again, this is just a sheer skeletal way. So it's a one-dimensional way of looking at it. Short torso, long femurs, short tib and fib. You're going to have a harder time getting low. Take that in reverse. Longer torso, shorter femur, longer tib fib. You're able to get lower in your stride. The other thing you meant is a longer ground contact. Look at sprinting and compare it to skating. They're not the same, right? It's a higher impulse, the integral of force over the interval of time. So you have longer time to produce that force. And sometimes, you can tell me if I'm wrong, sometimes there's just beautiful skaters that just look efficient. They're always in the right spot. it doesn't look like they're laborious in their stride, and it's just they glide over the ice. It's unbelievable to watch. I want to pivot slightly, Luke. Working with pros, so you went from now youth looking at efficiency, perfect body types anthropometrically. This is a tough question. All your years doing this as a coach and in figure skating at the elite level, do you feel you can tangibly make a change in an athlete's stride?
Yeah, that's a good question, because your stride and I think you even mentioned it earlier or off there, that stride signature or the habits that you have ingrained by the time you've reached that level of the sport are pretty well ingrained. It's going to be very difficult to change that motor pattern. So at the pro level, yeah, that's why I kind of like looking at players that we draft, because if you can draft guys that have attributes that I'm a fan of, and this was something I did a lot more when I worked with the Sharks previous to the Stars. Once you get those guys in the door, that's what you've got, right? You've drafted them; they're your property now. We got to figure out the best way to help them improve. Before that stage, you have the luxury of picking out what you want. So yeah, once you get a pro and we've drafted them and they're in our organization, if there's stride habits that I don't like or I don't consider to be efficient, it's really difficult to ever change those. But what you can do, what I've found, is there are little exercises that we can do to help that player understand where to efficiently and effectively drive power. So if, for example, I'm a big fan of rotational power in your stride. And so I'll get the 3D straps out on the ice and I'll put some resistance on it and skate alongside the player. So if we have a player that's pushing more back than generating power to the side, they're not really taking advantage of the rotational power that everyone should really have, we can work on that. And I think internally that helps because they feel the resistance of the strap. You got a little bit of that reactive neuromuscular training aspect involved. They start to feel like they're more efficient pushing against the power. Once we get out of the apparatus, if you will, then they can keep that feeling internally. And so I've not really changed their stride technique, but I've changed how they feel when they stride, which in turn might help them be more efficient.
Sure. But it's hard turning a Heiskanen, Rope, Hintz, Jamie Benn, Harley. It's hard to turn. It's hard to turn those skaters, as efficient as they are, into someone this average, right? You just small little interventions trying to move the needle, right?
Yeah. 100%. I'm glad you put Jamie's name in there because he's
Yeah,
so powerful and he
big
actually,
time.
for how big he is and strong he is, and then he's obviously incredibly tough on the ice. People
Oh,
forget about how good of a skater he is.
he is.
And he was the one that actually reached out and got me involved with the Stars. It was really just to work with him. He wanted to work on his skating in 2019, and so I worked with him all through the summer. And it was wild, really, because this might help us pivot into that equipment situation. But we did a ton of work out of the gate, and I was really impressed with all of his mechanics on the ice as they were. So then it became, can we periodize the summer to help us work on more dorsiflexion, maybe get a little more positive shin angle and some more mobility in the very lower mobile limb, and then quickly progress to game situation skating when the time was right. You don't want to get on the pedal too early with game situation skating in the summer. So we did a lot of exercises that reinforce those mechanics without doing game situation training to keep the load off early in the summer. But all of that to say, yeah, I mean, when you have players like that, it's a complete luxury. You have like Thomas Harley, who's an incredibly efficient skater. He works on it in the summer up in Buffalo, and it's great to see people like that already have positive attributes wearing the Stars jersey, working on their skating in the summer. Like for me, that's a dream.
When you're working at this high level, so many small little changes can lead to big differences, right? Because you're playing at the upper echelon. You mentioned, trying to get lower for Jamie, right? Or the shank, meaning from his shin bone all the way to his ankle complex. Target context, target environment, and maybe you can or can't answer this, so I don't want to put you in the spot. What would be some on-ice interventions that you feel would be able to be, maybe it's an equipment modification, I don't know. And then conversely, are there anything Is there anything away off the ice, ankle mobility work that you feel would help in that situation? And maybe it's not Jamie. Let's just use a different player, but something with a similar issue that you're trying to get lower and you're really wanting to focus on that ankle mobility.
Yeah, I mean, so you have to look at your equipment, I think, right out the gates, because we're going to get a little bit into that whole skipping and eyelet conversation,
Yep.
because you want to try and gain that ankle mobility. You want to get more of that dorsiflexion. So some people will cheat that corner by skipping that eyelet, and no different than watching golfers on the range. They're going to adjust all of that equipment to try and get every ounce of and power out of their equipment. So I can see why that became a thing early on, is skipping that eyelet so I can get more ankle flexion. And there's been, many other studies done on the energy leaks that come from that with certain players. And it's really, it's a bit of a holistic approach to it, if I got to be honest, because we have a few players here in-house that are smaller. I'm a smaller guy. I lace my skates all the way up, but I'm not a fan of suffocating that top eyelet, because I want to get the most A out of my ankle flexion, and then B, I want to get the most out of the material itself. And it's only going to bend if you fasten it correctly and then take advantage of the top eyelet is where the material is going to bend at its most, right? So you want to take all of the length of that material and then flex it where it needs to flex. So the lace extenders that some people have used, I know like True and some other people experimented with that before. So some of those things are good, but I do think that there's no better way to get that ankle flexion other than working on it over time. You got to work on your ankle flexion outside the skates, and then if that looks good and we get you in the skates and it's vastly different, can we at least loosen that top eyelet? Can we get you to where there's a little more play before you get into the meat of the skate? And naturally, the momentum of dropping your center of mass and weight into the boot will flex it, and then it will give back when you
That
release it.
recoil. That's right. Like a
That
slingshot,
recoils.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. So that's for me, educating the player on why I'm a big fan of lacing all the way up. Things like that help them understand, okay, maybe I should be lacing all the way up, but I just don't need to be cranking that top eyelet. It shouldn't be it shouldn't be a lat row just to tighten that top eyelet. Try and fasten it all evenly, and then let's play with that top eyelet so that we can get get that shank angle forward, get that positive shin angle without losing a ton of power.
The science of skates are arguably the most important tool for hockey players, aside potentially from a stick. But I think it's a delicate balance between what we call, that frontal plane stiffness and sagittal plane pliability. You want to get lower, but as you said, if you don't have that recoil or stiffness giving it back, your toe off is affected, right? These small little things. And I'm a smaller player. I was a smaller player. I know my nephew doesn't, my nieces don't, and they're obviously young kids. I lace my eyelets up all the way to the top, but I know that they wrote an article many years back, probably 6 or 7 years in the Athletic, that caused a big stir. Are the fastest players in the league all skipping an eyelet? And as usual, there's a lot of context there, and there's a lot of other things going on. But it is something I want to come back and talk with you about. We will pivot there, equipment wise. Commonalities maybe is a better question for skate setup for players that you see. Are there common traits that you see with the players that you work with in the National Hockey League level? Is it stiffness? Is it rocker? Is it a pitch?
I've noticed that more players are looking into that profiling now. And I think it's because the younger player is growing up with a profile on their skates, and that's helping have those intervention talks with guys at the pro level. So right now you're kind of seeing some pros that used to use profiles, and maybe they were on their own. Maybe they were kind of pioneers on looking into profiles. How can I, tweak my equipment to get more out of my game? Now with the at-home sharpener and the access to all of these profiling machines,
I
you
know.
get kids that are coming up now and they're like, hey, where's the profiling machine? Hey, where's that ES profile machine? They are educated in that field with their equipment. They're so dialed in that they're looking into that. So for me, when I first started experimenting with all different types of profiles, going back to the same fundamentals of knees over toes, hips behind heels, trying to have a good flat back through your T-spine. I actually think that if you have very solid squat mechanics and we put you on a slight forward pitch, it's going to help you get that center of mass in front of that ground contact, and I'm not talking, I think there's 3 settings on the elite profile machine. It doesn't have to be number 3. I've skated around on that number 3 setting, and it really does feel like it's putting you, like your ball of your foot is the main point of drive into the ground, which I actually like, but it's not something everyone should do because there's, once you get near the extremes and everyone's different, you could maybe invite an injury in there.
Luke,
But yeah,
educate me real quick. I'm going to interject because you're around this every day and I'm not. Talk to me about those settings 1, 2, 3. What does that look like from an anatomical standpoint?
Yeah, it basically refers to pitching your heel higher up, which obviously pitches you further forward. So it's like putting that lifting platform under your heels. And so 1 being the least severe, and then pitching it all the way up to a 3, that's really going to pitch you forward. And again, like I said, sometimes I don't mind that. Like a little trick that I've done before is explaining to some players that maybe have that trunk segmental angle where they lean forward a lot, putting them on a forward pitch for a little while naturally gets them to sit more upright, because now they feel like they're falling over their toes so much that it forces them to fix it internally. So that's something I've used in the past as a modality for fixing things, like that. And it doesn't have to be forever too. Once they feel like, hey, I'm more upright now, we've videoed, the angles look a little more to scale. I've always looked at 90 degrees in your knee bend and roughly 65 from that femur to your trunk segmental angle if I'm just videoing on the iPad. And sometimes that will improve, at which point you can tell that player, hey, let's maybe just get back into that quad 1 profile that you already like, but let's just put it at a 1 instead. Maybe they've switched to a different boot that already has a more aggressive pitch, so then you want to try and even that all out with that profile.
Excellent. No, there's so much to it. I spoke a couple of years back on the podcast with Matty Price for the LA Kings, and before he was involved in strength and conditioning, he's a former pro hockey player, but he was working in Canada skiing, a Canadian ski team. And he said, Ant, that the guys and girls were so finicky about their ski boots, just the setup, twisting, turning. He said, I was really surprised when I first got in the National Hockey League. He said, and now that's changing, but not that same tweaking, turning, twisting were skates. And I'm guessing because of all the new technologies, the younger kids involved, like that now, I believe that equipment modification, if you will, I think that's going to be a huge, huge impetus, specifically for high-level players, and tweaking ever so slightly without trying to re-ingrain or repattern something completely.
Like I joked about the 5-inch fairway earlier, that's the space between your ears, and it's really easy for you to get in your own head. However, to use that golf example again, something gives you confidence and it helps you play better that evening. I think that it has value. And if there's a player that, tries something out with their profiles and they feel more agile, maybe they get a little better rock from the arch of their foot through the ball of the foot through toe off just by getting a more aggressive profile in the front part of that blade, like, let's do it. I don't think there's a reason to say, hey, these profiles are kind of a new thing, so I don't really want to touch it and I don't want to try it and I don't want to mess up how I already play. That already sounds kind of negative to me, and more of these players that are coming in now are more open to suggestions with equipment tweaks. And like you said, I think when you look at other sports, Formula One or anything, there's minute changes you can make, and it actually does move the needle. And so now more players are intrigued by that versus the maybe the setbacks of trying something new and it being tougher to get along with.
Sure. I think too, and this is completely off subject, but I think sticks as well, and the lies of sticks, right? That affects. I mean, if you're having a difficult time getting a low, a different lie on your stick might be those two tools. I think a lot of the companies are spending large dollars on in terms of measures of research, because in my opinion, arguably the 2 most important tools, and they can affect skating stride and obviously shot speed and accuracy as well. What about rocker implications? Deeper rockers, deeper hollows. Do you get into that at all, or is it? I'll give you an example. I interviewed Pete Friesen, former athletic trainer, strength coach, and pretty much wore every hat for the Carolina Hurricanes. And he talked about the implications for coming back, whether it be a hip injury or a leg injury, and obviously deeper hollows, digging into the ice more, affecting hips, soft tissue, et cetera, as opposed to a flatter hollow, again, meant for being over the ice, a little bit faster in a straight line. Are players finicky about that, specifically with return to play? Do you see anything or make any recommendations based on that, or is it too granular?
That's interesting because I was involved a lot more in return to play skating with San Jose, and our other skills coach here in Dallas does a lot of the return to play skating here, and it's interesting because you don't get that question often, and you would, like you said, you would think more players would say, like you said, you're always kind of delicate after coming back from an injury. I'm coming off an injury myself right now,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I haven't sharpened my skates since getting back on the ice, mainly because I just want to glide, take it easy. I don't want any bite, right? Like I don't want anyone pulling me into a position that I'm not ready to be in. So it's surprising more players haven't mentioned that, honestly. Now going just back to, in general, the hollow of the skate kind of ties back into my agility pillar, where I'm a big fan of how, when you're experimenting with hollows, how sharp can we go before it feels like it really affects your linear speed. So an example would be, I would rather see somebody that's agile, can make cuts and get themselves out of trouble or get into scoring positions, rather than somebody that only wants straight line speed. Because then, in my opinion, that's straight line speed. You can train the body to be more powerful in a straight line. Agility, sometimes there's no give and take there. It's going to have to be, I'm relying on the grip of the wheels at the end of the day. I've got to make sure I've got the right setup underneath me to make those sharp turns. So when it comes to hollows, that's what I've always encouraged. And that's why I was really surprised to see the flat bottom V. It came into the sport and it was heavy. People loved it for a while, and then just like fizzled out because it was so new and it felt so different that guys didn't really want to try it. And that kind of goes back to my original, the other point of, I tried it out and I had speed in a straight line. And I'm not a spokesperson for a Blackstone, but
Sure,
I
sure,
had
sure.
speed in a straight line, but I had rapid deceleration and I had, sharp turns. I could rely on my edges. I could really lean on my outside edge as I wanted, and never felt like it was giving out from underneath me. So yeah, that's where I felt like I can see why people want that straight line speed, because that's the game. If it's me and you in a race just to get there, and at the end of the day, the rink is an oval. There's more space to accelerate forward than there is side to side. But yeah, I really was surprised to see that not catch on more.
Interesting. You mentioned return to play, and you mentioned there is in Dallas an individual responsible for return to play. Where is that baton passed to you? Is that before that individual or during that individual's acclimation onto the ice?
Yeah, it's a little bit of during. Sometimes there will be times where our skills coach will say, Luke, do you want to come in and do some edge work with this guy? Do we want to if we have a defenseman that's coming off of an injury, for example, maybe we can run more defensive skating specific drills, which I like because it reinforces some of those habits. And coming off an injury, it forces you to really think through those mechanics again, which can sometimes create a better correlation between something they were working on in season, but it was just too much going on. So really, it just depends on um, who all is running those skates, and at what point they feel like we can introduce maybe a bit of a free variable, like somebody else working on something new that maybe hasn't been a part of the ramp up to their return to play.
Excellent. Final pivot here. Where can we learn more about you from our audience?
Yeah, I have some social media accounts. My Instagram is probably the best place to follow me, and that's at Chilcott Skating, and that's on Instagram. And I try to post examples of what I'm working on as much as I can. I almost prefer to use my Instagram a bit like publishing material. So if there's something that I've really put the time and effort into, and it's a drill that I like, and it seems to be helping players understand skating specific mechanics, then I'll post it. So yeah, there's some good videos on there. Hopefully, they help anyone from learn to play all the way up to pros. Honestly, there's some of the edge work that I have 10 new players doing, and that might be their learning it, and a pro guy could even watch that and see the process of the footwork and want to layer that in the off season. So yeah, that my Instagram is probably the best source for that, and I'll try and get more out.
Outstanding, which leads me to another question. Sorry, I said final pivot, but you said
No.
Instagram. And where does video fit in for you? Are you a big fan of video? Are you able to watch and break down things with either your young intermediate level hockey players or with your National League players?
I rely a lot on video, and I used a lot of video when I was training. It was beneficial for me to see what I was doing, and then with that professional eye from a coach, being able to point out where the end goal would be and where I'm at currently, and then bridging that gap. Kind of gave me a target. So I like to do that a lot with players of all levels. You'll always see me bringing an iPad out to the side of the rink, because if I've explained something and the player doesn't fully feel it, and then I show them what I think it could be like, that is really the moment for most people. So yeah, there's a huge emphasis on using video in my coaching philosophy.
You and I mentioned a couple off air. What do you like to use? Are there any apps from a biomechanical standpoint, or is it just video, touch and play?
Yeah, I use OnFilm a lot, and I know we didn't touch on it earlier with my duties with the Dallas Stars, but one of them is in prospect development. So when I'm working with our prospects, I will visit them with their junior programs or wherever they are, and I'll capture video. And then obviously what I can do then is I can annotate or I can use voiceover. And OnFilm's been great for that. And again, not a plug for OnForm. It's just something I've used through research and using different other applications. But that one's great. Yeah, it creates a way for me to drop video off to the player and have them have it in their pocket on their phone. It's personal. It's kind of, there's a direct line between myself and the prospect. And like I mentioned, if they have some skills ice, then Monday through Friday or whenever, they can always video themselves, send it to me, and it allows me to remote coach pretty fluidly.
Yeah, I think it's there. Dan Paff is a famous track coach, and he's had a massive impact on me. And when you're sprinting so fast, or when you're skating so fast, it's great to have a trained coach's eye, but to really show an athlete those faults in either slow motion, still frame, I think can really sell the point. And at least they can see some of the things that you're talking about through your coach's eye. I just think that element, specifically from a higher level, if you have the ability and you have the resources, I think that video or some sort of replay is really, really important in teaching.
Yeah, well, I think yeah, it's 100% true. I mean, every athlete that's gotten to this level is obviously self-confident, and so it can be difficult to have that intervention of trying to tell them there's something they could be doing better. And that's not like the player has an ego, even though some players do. But being self-confident and having an ego sometimes can be very different things. And so if I bring a technique to that player, the video helps that player and myself have a conversation. And that really changes the kind of the temperature of the water, if you will, because now I can say, here's what I was talking about. Here's you doing it. Now I want your feedback as to whether you think that's something you'd like to work on, or am I even off? Am I seeing something that maybe isn't it's a non-issue, and I'm bringing it up and adding more noise to the situation. So those videos, they're massive really, because it allows me to, like you said, it's such a fast moving sport that it allows me to pinpoint things that they might feel is in that law of diminishing returns and show them, and we can have that conversation like, oh, that's something you do want to really work on. Okay, well then tomorrow for that NHL AHL level, like let's just work on that tiny tweak, and maybe it turns into an in-game adjustment.
Sure. I said final pivot. I think I'm lying here. Now this is the second question that's not the final pivot. When you set up a skate, take a fictitious player on the roster, non-injured, what does that look like? 45 minutes, an hour, and then I call it favorable prerequisites, right? Like you have an order, you have a menu, you have a recipe. Like you have orders of the recipe, then the ingredients that you use. What do you like to focus on first? What do you try to build on? Is there a quote unquote favorable prerequisite throughout the touch points on the ice?
It's tricky because the level of the player, and I mean what level they're currently playing at, might dictate how long I have there. And I'm obviously fortunate enough to be working with your brother this season. Misha's been great to have in town. But he always says, even if you've got that 20 minutes or 15 minutes before practice, it's gold bullion. You gotta make the most of that 10, 15 minutes, right? And so if it's a player at the NHL level, then I better have game situation footwork ready for them. And it's, hey, here's what happened the other night. Maybe you can use analytics as a bit of an intervention. Hey, we're not getting as many pucks through from the blue line. So in that 15 minutes, let's just warm up some edge work to get you going and then dive right into footwork for the OZ blue line. And then if you work it backwards, now I have more time before and after practice at the AHL level. Now we can kind of get into more of that edge work. We can include some of the edge work fundamental drills that I believe make skaters fundamentally more sound, and then build into that game situation footwork. So a bit of the level and the time dictates some of that process and that approach to building that plan for the day for that player. But no, if I have the time, 100%, I start off with edge work. We work through the same drills, and I do because I think ups in the pro levels and even at the youth level, that's a great opportunity for you to flip the switches on, prime all the engines, kind of get into the feeling of skating because it is unnatural no matter how long you do it. And so, yeah, if you can warm up through that edge work, I do think it's fundamentally sound to turn those feels on before you play the game.
I know it's kind of, a lot of people say this and it's been echoed a lot. I had the opportunity to, it was a cool interview a couple of years ago, I interviewed Mike Babcock, and he talked about the best player ever he coached, whoever coached, it was Nick Lidstrom. He said in a matter of fact way, I said, why? He said he embraced the monotony of being a pro. And I view that, and I would like your lens. I think that should be the way, like edge work. Like you can take something boring and make it fun, but at the end of the day, it's edge work. The guys that want to hone on it and practice it repetitively till it's never perfected, but they're always eager to try to work on it, if that makes sense. They're not reinventing the wheel. They embrace that monotony. Do you see that with elite players?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely guys out there that embody that, and that would be a great example more than anything. But there are some guys, I mean, right the way down to, I love those clips that you see some of the reporters have on Twitter or Instagram or somewhere where it'll be Crosby getting out there and just edge work down one side of the ice, inside edges, outsides down the other side of the ice. Maybe McDavid doing some of his like inside edge single leg pumps around a circle. You see those, and obviously I'm advocating for skating at all times because that's my passion. But you see that, and it does, it excites you because there they are finding a way to make a long season a way to maintain a certain base level of skating, and like you said, sometimes it can be a weapon to at least maintain a baseline. And that's where that edge work stuff comes in. That's where if you've got certain passing drills you want to do, edge work, shooting drills, like releasing pucks from different positions, those are all things that you got to do to maintain that skill level throughout the year. And that probably falls right in that same bin of like, there's some monotony to being a pro, and it might seem mundane, but you got to be, brilliant at the basics at the end of the day. If that is, what you can maintain, or maybe even improve incrementally throughout the season, if you're a team that's fortunate enough to make the playoffs, and even if you're not, you're setting an example for others.
Specifically at the youth level, we call it the core four in our hockey camp: skating, passing, shooting, and puck handling. The bottom line is if you can't skate, you can't do any of the other ones. Right?
Yeah.
So you can't skate, you can't play. What's next for you, Luke? Are you working on any projects? Are you growing the business? What's next for you?
Yeah, next for me, honestly, is I would love to get some more edge work filmed and packaged together so other people could maybe purchase it and what have you down the line. I think there's a lot of room out there for things like that. That, as the strength and conditioning world has many online subscription based programs, and I'd love to be able to get something going for skate technique specifically, because there's a lot of great voices out there. I'd like to throw my 2 cents into that ring and have the youth hockey parent reach out or maybe even have access to what I'm doing without needing to be on the ice as much. I think that's a big limiting factor, and there should be more material out there for people to purchase and educate themselves. As much as I'd like to work with as many players as I can in person, we're fortunate to be able to have the internet and have ways of doing that without being there all the time. And sometimes that's a better modality for people to train anyway. So hopefully I can get going on a project like that soon here while I'm in all the craziness of youth hockey seasons and pro hockey seasons, and then all of them in the off season.
Our guest today has been Luke Chilcott. Luke, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely.